Imagine sailing across one of the most dangerous oceans on Earth. You leave behind your home, your family, everything you've ever known. After months at sea, you finally arrive in a land filled with endless forests, strange wildlife, and opportunities that seem almost limitless. You begin building a new life. You build homes. You plant crops. You dream about the future. Then, without warning, you disappear. Not one person survives to explain what happened. No bodies are found. No signs of a final battle. No farewell letter. Only one mysterious word carved into a wooden post. Croatoan. More than 400 years have passed since that word was discovered, and historians still cannot say with complete certainty what happened to the people who carved it. This is not a ghost story. It is not a legend. It is a real historical mystery. And many historians believe the truth may be even more fascinating than the mystery itself. This is the story of the lost colony of Roanoke. To understand how an entire colony disappeared, we first have to travel back to the late 16th century. Europe was changing. Powerful kingdoms competed to control the oceans. Ships crossed waters that had once seemed impossible to navigate. Every successful voyage promised wealth, influence, and power. Among those kingdoms was England. Queen Elizabeth I watched as Spain grew richer with every expedition to the Americas. Spanish ships returned loaded with silver, gold, and valuable goods. England wanted its own place in this new world. One of the men determined to make that happen was Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh believed England needed a permanent colony across the Atlantic. Such a settlement could strengthen England's position, provide new resources, and become the beginning of something much larger. It was an ambitious dream, but dreams are easy. Crossing the Atlantic in the 1500s was not. Today, a flight from London to the east coast of North America takes less than a day. In 1587, the same journey took weeks, sometimes months. Passengers lived aboard crowded wooden ships. Fresh food quickly spoiled. Clean drinking water became limited. Storms appeared without warning. Disease spread easily. Many people who began the voyage never reached the other side. Those who did knew something important. Once they sailed away from England, there was no guarantee they would ever return. Yet more than 100 settlers volunteered. Some hoped to own land. Others wanted a better future for their children. Some simply believed they were helping build history. Among them was a talented artist and mapmaker named John White. White had already traveled to North America before. Unlike many explorers of his time, he carefully observed the people and landscapes around him. His paintings remain some of the earliest visual records of the region. This time, however, he was not traveling as an artist alone. He had been appointed governor of the new colony. More than 100 lives would depend on his leadership. As the ships finally left England, excitement mixed with fear. Families watched the coastline slowly disappear. Children stared at the endless sea. Nobody knew exactly what awaited them, only that everything familiar had been left behind. Weeks later, after surviving the Atlantic, they finally reached the coast of what is now North Carolina. The landscape was unlike anything they had seen before. Dense forests stretched toward the horizon. Marshes surrounded winding waterways. Birds filled the sky. Fish crowded the nearby waters. From a distance, the land seemed untouched, but it was not empty. Long before the English arrived, Indigenous peoples had lived throughout this region for generations. They understood the tides, the seasons, the forests, the rivers. Everything the newcomers would now have to learn. The English chose to settle on Roanoke Island, a small island protected by the chain of barrier islands known today as the Outer Banks. At first, the decision seemed promising. The settlers immediately began working. Trees were cut. Wooden houses were built. Gardens were prepared. Fences marked the edges of the growing settlement. Every day brought another small step toward the future they had imagined back in England. For a brief time, the dream appeared to be coming true. Then something happened that lifted everyone's spirits. John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to a baby girl. She was named Virginia Dare. She became the first English child known to have been born in this part of North America. For the settlers, her birth symbolized hope. A child born in this new land. A future that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. No one could have imagined that her name would one day become one of the most famous in American history. Because Virginia Dare would also become one of its greatest mysteries. Despite moments of celebration, life on Roanoke was far from easy. The settlers quickly realized that building a colony required far more than constructing houses. Food supplies were running lower than expected. The environment was unfamiliar. Growing crops proved difficult. Some relationships with neighboring indigenous communities became strained, shaped in part by earlier English expeditions that had damaged trust before this colony had even arrived. Every week presented another challenge. The leaders of the settlement faced a difficult reality. Without additional supplies from England, surviving the coming months would become increasingly uncertain. There was only one solution. Someone had to return across the Atlantic and bring help back before it was too late. That responsibility fell to Governor John White. It was the last decision he wanted to make. His daughter remained on the island. His newborn granddaughter remained there too. Leaving meant placing their lives in the hands of fate. But staying without supplies might place everyone's lives at risk. White promised the colonists he would return as quickly as possible. He embraced his family. He said goodbye to the people who had trusted him enough to cross an ocean. Then he boarded the waiting ship. As the sails filled with wind, Roanoke Island slowly disappeared behind him. John White believed he would be gone for only a few months. He had no way of knowing that events unfolding thousands of miles away in England were about to change everything. Because while the colonists waited for his return, England was preparing for war. And before John White could keep his promise, the people of Roanoke would quietly disappear into history. John White believed he would be back before the settlers had time to worry. The plan seemed simple. Sail to England, gather supplies, return to Roanoke before winter became a serious threat. It was a difficult journey, but it was possible. Or at least, it should have been. When White finally arrived in England, he expected to organize a rescue expedition almost immediately. Instead, he stepped into a country on the edge of war. For years, tensions between England and Spain had been growing. The two kingdoms competed for power, wealth, and influence across Europe and the Atlantic. English ships attacked Spanish treasure fleets. Spain viewed England as a dangerous rival. By 1587, everyone knew that open conflict was becoming inevitable. Suddenly, England's priorities changed. Ships that might have carried food to Roanoke were claimed for military service. Experienced sailors joined the Royal Navy, harbors filled with preparations for a conflict that threatened the entire kingdom. To England's leaders, defending the country came first. A small colony across the Atlantic would have to wait. For John White, the news was devastating. Every day he remained in England was another day his family remained alone. His daughter, Eleanor, his infant granddaughter, Virginia Dare, more than 100 settlers who believed he would soon return. White pleaded for help. He searched for ships. He spoke with merchants, investors, and officials. Again and again, the answer was the same. There were no ships to spare. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. White could do little except wait. Imagine carrying that burden. Every morning he woke with the same question. Are they still alive? He had no letters, no messengers, no way to communicate across the Atlantic. The ocean that had once connected England to its new colony now felt like an impossible barrier. Meanwhile, life on Roanoke grew harder. We don't know exactly what happened during those missing years. No diary has ever been found. No journal tells us how the settlers spent their final months on the island. But we do know the challenges they faced. Food was limited. The colony depended on successful harvests, fishing, and hunting. One poor season could threaten everyone. Imagine waking before sunrise to search for food, not knowing whether your family would have enough to eat that evening. Imagine watching the horizon every day, waiting for sails that never appeared. At first, the settlers probably remained hopeful. Ships were often delayed. Storms were common. Perhaps White had encountered bad weather. Perhaps another vessel was already on its way. But as the months passed, hope slowly became uncertainty. Then uncertainty became fear. What if England had forgotten them? The colony's leaders now faced impossible choices. Should they remain where they were and continue waiting? Or should they move somewhere with better access to food and stronger relationships with nearby indigenous communities? Neither option was without risk. Staying might lead to starvation. Leaving meant abandoning everything they had built. Their homes, their gardens, their dreams. Sometimes history turns on great battles. Sometimes it turns on quiet conversations around a campfire. No one knows exactly when the discussion took place. Perhaps it happened after another disappointing harvest. Perhaps after another season passed without a ship. Perhaps while parents watched their children grow thinner with each passing week. Somewhere, somehow, the settlers reached a decision. Back in England, the situation grew even worse. In 1588, Spain launched what became known as the Spanish Armada, a massive fleet sent to invade England. The country entered a state of emergency. Nearly every available ship was needed for defense. England eventually defeated the Armada in one of the most important naval victories in its history. For the nation, it was a triumph. For John White, it was another heartbreaking delay. By now, nearly 2 years had passed since he had left Roanoke. 2 years. Imagine seeing your granddaughter only as a newborn, then realizing she might already be learning to speak. Or worse, wondering if she was still alive at all. White refused to give up. He eventually secured passage aboard a smaller expedition heading toward the Atlantic. Finally, it seemed he would keep his promise. But fate intervened once again. The ships encountered French privateers, armed vessels authorized to attack enemy shipping. A fierce fight followed. The expedition was forced to turn back. White returned to England once more. Another opportunity had slipped away. Another season had been lost. Years later, White would write about his frustration and sorrow. He had not abandoned the colony. He had tried again and again to return. History had simply placed obstacles in his path that he could not overcome. Then, at last, in 1590, almost 3 years after leaving Roanoke, John White finally found another chance. This time, nothing would stop him. As the ship crossed the Atlantic, he must have imagined the reunion countless times. Perhaps the colony had survived. Perhaps Eleanor would be waiting on the beach. Perhaps little Virginia Dare, no longer a baby, would run toward him the moment she saw the ship. Those thoughts carried him across the ocean. They gave him hope. But hope can be a dangerous thing, because sometimes the picture we carry in our minds is very different from the one waiting on the shore. As the Carolina coastline finally appeared on the horizon, White stood on the deck in silence. He searched the distant land for the first sign of life. Smoke from a cooking fire. A boat pulled onto the beach. Anything. He saw nothing. The closer the ship came to Roanoke Island, the quieter everyone became. No one aboard realized it yet, but they were about to step into one of history's greatest mysteries. The small boat drifted toward the shore. No one spoke. The only sounds were the steady splash of the oars and the waves rolling onto the sand. John White stood at the front of the boat, his eyes fixed on Roanoke Island. For almost 3 years, he had imagined this moment. Every delay, every failed voyage, every storm, every night spent wondering whether his family was still alive. It had all led to this. Now he was finally home. Or so he thought. The boat scraped gently against the beach. Before anyone else had fully stepped onto the sand, White climbed out and began walking toward the settlement. He expected to hear voices, children laughing, axes striking wood, dogs barking, smoke rising from cooking fires. Instead, there was only silence. At first, he tried to convince himself that the settlers were simply away, hunting or fishing. Perhaps they hadn't seen the ship yet. Perhaps they would appear at any moment. But as he walked farther inland, that hope began to disappear. The familiar path leading to the colony was still there. Barely. Grass had grown over much of it. Bushes crept across the trail. Nature had slowly begun reclaiming the land. White's pace quickened. His heartbeat grew louder with every step. Then, he reached the settlement and stopped. The colony was empty. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Empty. For a long moment, White simply stared. This couldn't be right. This was the place where more than 100 people had lived, where families had built homes, where Virginia Dare had been born, where he had promised everyone he would return. Now, there was nothing. He walked through the clearing. The houses were gone. Not burned, not smashed apart. Gone. Looking closer, White noticed something strange. The buildings hadn't been destroyed. They had been carefully dismantled. The wooden beams were missing. The planks had been removed. It looked as though the settlers had deliberately taken their homes apart. That single detail changed everything. If the colony had been attacked suddenly, there would have been chaos. Burned buildings, broken furniture, scattered belongings, signs of panic. Instead, the settlement looked organized, almost as if everyone had packed their belongings and left on purpose. For the first time since landing, White felt a small spark of hope. If they had dismantled their homes, maybe they had simply moved. Maybe they were still alive. He continued searching. Every building site, every pathway, every corner of the clearing. He hoped to find a letter, a journal, anything. Then something caught his attention. A tall wooden post stood near the edge of the settlement. Across its surface, deep letters had been carved into the wood. White stepped closer. He brushed away dirt and moss. Slowly, the word became clear. Croatoan. He froze. To anyone else, it might have seemed meaningless, but White immediately recognized it. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, known today as Hatteras Island. It was also the home of an indigenous community that had maintained relatively friendly relations with the English. Then White remembered a conversation that had taken place years earlier. Before leaving for England, he and the settlers had discussed exactly this situation. If they were forced to move before his return, they would carve the name of their destination somewhere he could find it. There was one more part of the agreement. If they were leaving because they were under attack, if they were fleeing for their lives, they would carve a Christian cross beside the message. White looked again. No cross. Only one word. Croatoan. His mind raced. Had they really made it there? Had they found safety? Was Eleanor waiting for him on another island just a short journey away? Was Virginia Dare alive? The answers seemed close, closer than they had been in years. White searched the settlement again, this time even more carefully. Near one of the trees, he noticed another carving, only 3 letters. CRO. Perhaps someone had started carving the message there before choosing the wooden post instead. Or perhaps it marked the same direction. No one knows, but it confirmed one thing. The word Croatoan had been left intentionally. This was no accident. White continued looking for any other clue. A piece of clothing, a child's toy, a cooking pot, a buried chest. Nothing. No skeletons, no graves, no bloodstains, no abandoned weapons, no evidence of a desperate last stand. It was as though an entire community had simply stood up one day, gathered everything they owned, and quietly disappeared. For historians, this is one of the most important moments in the entire mystery, because what wasn't found may be just as important as what was. No bodies, no burned buildings, no signs of a massacre. That doesn't prove the settlers survived, but it does make one thing clear. Whatever happened, it probably didn't happen here. White immediately urged the ship's captains to continue south toward Croatoan Island. If the settlers had left a message, then surely the next step was to follow it. His daughter might still be alive. His granddaughter might still be alive. Every hour mattered. But once again, nature had other plans. Dark clouds gathered offshore. The wind began to strengthen. Experienced sailors watched the sea with growing concern. Late summer along the Carolina coast was dangerous. A powerful storm could destroy every ship in the fleet. The captains refused to continue. White pleaded with them. He begged. He argued. He reminded them that more than 100 lives might depend on one more day's journey. The answer never changed. The weather was becoming too dangerous. The risk was too great. Reluctantly, the order was given to leave. As the ship sailed away from Roanoke Island, John White stood on the deck watching the shoreline disappear into the distance. He had crossed an ocean to keep his promise. He had returned exactly as he had said he would. But he had arrived years too late. He never saw his daughter again. He never saw Virginia Dare again. He never discovered what became of the people he had led across the Atlantic. The colony was gone. Only one clue remained. One word, carved into weathered wood. A word that would puzzle historians for more than 4 centuries. Croatoan. But was it the answer? Or just the beginning of an even greater mystery? For more than 400 years, one word has stood at the center of this mystery. Croatoan. It has appeared in books, documentaries, history classes, even horror movies. But what did it actually mean? To answer that question, we have to set aside the legends and return to the evidence. When John White discovered the carving, he did not react with fear. He reacted with recognition. He already knew the name. Croatoan was a nearby island, now known as Hatteras Island. It was also the homeland of an indigenous community that White had met during earlier voyages. Compared with some neighboring groups, relations with the Croatoan people had generally been peaceful. That detail is important. The settlers had not carved the name of an unknown destination. They had carved the name of a place they already knew. And according to White's own account, the colonists had agreed on something before he sailed back to England. If they ever needed to move before his return, they would leave behind the name of the place they were going. If they were forced to leave because of immediate danger, they would carve a Christian cross beside the message. When White found the settlement, there was no cross, just one carefully carved word. To many modern historians, that single missing symbol changes the entire story. It suggests the settlers did not flee Roanoke in blind panic. Instead, they may have left with a plan. Imagine the colony during those long months after White sailed away. Every morning begins with the same routine. Check the shoreline, look toward the sea. Wait for sails. None appear. The gardens produce less food than expected. The hunting parties must travel farther into unfamiliar forests. Fishing helps, but not enough. Every passing season makes one thing painfully clear. Help is not coming. Not yet. Perhaps around a fire one evening, the colony's leaders gather. No one wants to say the words aloud, but everyone is thinking them. We can't stay here. The silence that follows is heavy, because leaving means abandoning everything they have built. The houses, the gardens, the dreams that carried them across the Atlantic. Yet staying could be even more dangerous. If food continues to disappear, if winter arrives before supplies, the colony may not survive another year. What would you choose? Remain where hope is fading? Or move toward people who understand the land better than you ever could? The indigenous communities living along the Carolina coast had spent generations learning this environment. They knew which fish appeared in different seasons. They knew where fresh water could be found during dry months. They knew which plants were safe to eat and which could heal sickness. The English possessed determination. The indigenous people possessed knowledge. For settlers struggling to survive, that knowledge may have been priceless. Many historians believe the colonists decided to relocate rather than wait for rescue. That conclusion is supported by several pieces of evidence. The houses were dismantled instead of destroyed. Valuable timber was removed rather than abandoned. No signs of widespread violence appeared at the settlement, and the message left for John White pointed toward a known destination. None of these clues proves the theory, but together, they tell a remarkably consistent story. Years later, English explorers traveling through the region heard intriguing reports. Some indigenous communities were said to possess European tools. Others were described as having people with lighter-colored eyes, or who practiced customs that seemed familiar to the English. Those stories immediately attracted attention. Had the missing colonists joined nearby communities? It was possible, but historians approach such accounts with caution. Many of those reports were recorded years, sometimes decades, after Roanoke disappeared. Some passed through several translators before reaching English officials. Stories can change, details can grow, memories can fade. They are valuable clues. They are not definitive proof. Then archaeology entered the picture. Excavations in parts of coastal North Carolina uncovered fragments of English pottery dating to the late 16th century. Metal tools, glass beads, pieces of everyday life that appeared to connect English settlers with indigenous communities. Exciting discoveries. But archaeology is rarely simple. An English object does not automatically mean an English family lived there. Trade networks existed long before large European settlements. Objects changed hands. A single knife or bowl might travel dozens of kilometers through exchange between different communities. Researchers therefore looked for patterns rather than isolated finds. Were several English artifacts discovered together? Did they date to the correct period? Were they found alongside evidence of long-term occupation? These questions mattered more than any single object. Little by little, the evidence began painting a picture, not a complete picture, but one that suggested movement rather than sudden destruction. Perhaps the colonists divided into smaller groups. Perhaps some reached Croatoan, while others traveled inland. Perhaps families made different decisions, depending on where they believed they had the best chance to survive. If that happened, the phrase "the lost colony" may not be entirely accurate. From England's perspective, the settlers vanished. And yet, not everyone agrees with this explanation. Some historians argue that another fate may have awaited the settlers, a harsher one involving hunger, disease, conflict, or a combination of all three. Those theories have been debated for generations, and each one attempts to answer the same haunting question. If the people of Roanoke left the island, what happened next? That is where the mystery becomes even more complicated. If the settlers really left Roanoke Island, what happened after they disappeared into the forests and waterways of coastal North Carolina? That question has challenged historians for more than 4 centuries. And strangely, the deeper researchers investigate, the more human the story becomes. One of the oldest theories is that the settlers simply starved. It sounds believable. Food was already running low before John White sailed back to England. The colony depended on successful harvests, hunting, fishing, and the limited supplies they had brought from England. As those supplies disappeared, survival became more difficult. Imagine opening the last barrel of grain, knowing no more was coming. Parents quietly giving their children the larger share of food. Hunters returning home with empty hands. One failed harvest could put the entire colony at risk. Historians believe food shortages almost certainly influenced the settlers' decisions. But starvation alone doesn't explain the evidence. If the colonists had died at Roanoke, John White would likely have found graves, bodies, or abandoned possessions. Instead, he found a settlement that appeared to have been left deliberately. Starvation may have been the reason they moved, not the reason they disappeared. Another possibility is disease. Life in the 16th century was dangerous. Minor infections could become deadly, clean water was limited, and malnutrition weakened the body. Disease may have spread through the colony. But once again, the evidence is incomplete. No cemetery from the colony's final days has been found. No historical account describes an epidemic. Disease may have been part of the story, but it does not appear to explain everything. Then comes the theory many people find the most dramatic: conflict. Relations between English settlers and indigenous communities were complicated from the beginning. Some groups traded peacefully. Others remembered earlier English expeditions that had damaged trust. Could the settlers have been attacked? It's certainly possible. But historians ask an important question. If a large attack destroyed the colony, where is the evidence? There were no burned buildings, no signs of a major battle, no human remains. Instead, John White found dismantled houses and a carefully carved message. That doesn't rule out violence entirely. The settlers may have encountered conflict after leaving Roanoke, but the evidence suggests the colony itself was abandoned in an organized way. Many historians now believe the answer wasn't one disaster, but several: food shortages, disease, isolation, storms, uncertainty. Each problem added more pressure until leaving became the colony's best chance of survival. It may not be the most dramatic explanation, but history is often shaped by ordinary people making difficult decisions. Modern archaeology has added another piece to the puzzle. Researchers have discovered English pottery, metal tools, and other artifacts in different parts of coastal North Carolina. None of these discoveries solves the mystery by itself, but together they suggest that English settlers, or at least English goods, reached more than one location after Roanoke was abandoned. Some archaeologists believe the colonists divided into smaller groups. One may have gone toward Croatoan. Others may have traveled inland. If that's true, there was never one final destination. There were many. Then came another fascinating discovery. While examining one of John White's original maps with modern imaging technology, researchers found what appeared to be the symbol of a small fort hidden beneath a patch of paper. Was it a planned settlement? A backup location? No one knows. But the discovery encouraged archaeologists to investigate inland sites, where they uncovered more late 16th century English artifacts. Interesting enough to keep the mystery alive, not enough to solve it. And perhaps that's the most honest conclusion. Every broken piece of pottery, every weathered nail, every faded document brings us a little closer. Yet after more than 4 centuries, the final answer remains just beyond our reach. Maybe it always will. Or maybe it's still waiting beneath the soil, ready to be discovered. More than 400 years have passed since the people of Roanoke disappeared. Empires have risen and fallen. Wars have reshaped the world. Technology has transformed human life. Yet one mystery has survived every generation. What really happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? After examining the evidence, one thing becomes clear. The answer is probably less dramatic than the legends, but far more human. John White returned to an abandoned settlement. The houses had been carefully dismantled. There were no signs of a great battle, no burned buildings, no mass graves, only one carefully carved word: Croatoan. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't carved in panic. It was left where John White would find it. Almost as if the settlers were saying, "We didn't disappear, we moved." If that's true, then the story changes completely. Perhaps the people of Roanoke never believed they were becoming history's greatest mystery. They were simply trying to survive. Imagine that final morning. Families quietly pack the few belongings they can carry. Children hold blankets and small bundles. Men salvage timber from the homes they built. Women gather tools, seeds, and cooking pots. They know waiting is no longer an option. Before leaving, someone walks to a wooden post. With careful hands, they carve one final message: Croatoan. Not for history, not for future archaeologists, for John White. A simple message from one leader to another. Then they leave. Some may have traveled by boat. Others may have followed rivers and forest trails. Some may have joined nearby indigenous communities. Others may have settled elsewhere. The truth may never be known with complete certainty. Perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of asking, how did they disappear? Maybe we should ask, how did they survive? Because this has never really been a story about ghosts, curses, or the supernatural. It is the story of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Today, archaeologists continue searching. Every excavation, every broken piece of pottery, every weathered nail, every forgotten document brings us one step closer to the truth. Perhaps one day, a new discovery will finally reveal what happened to the lost colony. Or perhaps Roanoke will keep its secret forever. Either way, its legacy remains. Not because of what was found, but because of what was left unanswered. As the sun sets over Roanoke Island, the Atlantic Ocean still washes against the shore, just as it did in 1587. The wind still moves through the trees. The forests remain silent. Beneath that peaceful landscape lies the memory of more than 100 people who crossed an ocean searching for a better future. They never imagined they would become one of history's greatest mysteries. And perhaps that is why Roanoke continues to fascinate us. Because history is not only a record of what we know, it is also a reminder of what time has taken away. Sometimes, the questions with no clear answers become the stories we remember the longest. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this true mystery, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more real stories that history still can't fully explain.